All right, so we're going to do a little review on the final exam. We're going to focus on the long essays, okay? So the first essay, the tonic, right? What historical political events shaped the canonization of the tonic? Okay, so here what you need to talk about is basically how the Assyrian Empire, followed by the Babylonian Empire, followed by the Persian Empire, followed by the Greek Empire, and then the Greek Empire was split into the Hellenistic empires, right, after the death of Alexander the Great. And then that was followed by the Roman Empire, all colonized and occupied Israel, ancient Israel. Israel was also called, as we talked about, Judea, which is where the term Judaism comes from. So the point there is to talk about how these really this period of violence, occupation, oppression really played a fundamental role in the development of and the eventual canonization of the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible, right? So we talked about, for example, when the Babylonians destroyed the first temple and exiled Jewish communities. In exile, right, without the temple, they basically reified their religion around a collection of texts, right? And so really it creates during the Babylonian exodus really the impetus for what we now know as the Tanakh. And then of course, along with this, really this emphasis on texts comes to be increasingly developed as these period of colonization continues, right? Because eventually, as we talked about in 73 CE, Rome burns Jerusalem to the ground and effectively renames Israel Palestine, right? After Jewish community's most hated enemy, right? The Philistines in the Bible. So really, that's the key thing that I'm looking for. And how did it heighten a focus on masculinity? Well, the idea is that this period of intense colonization really had an emasculating effect on Jewish communities, which is often the case during periods of colonization and occupation. So a sense of, we are true men here, right? We are these true, strong men who can fight back against these Greek and Roman colonizers. So we see kind of this heightened aggressive focus on a strong masculinity, right, in the Tanakh. And that's probably the result of that period of intense violence, oppression, and persecution by these foreign empires. Okay, so number 2, what does the Gospel of Philip reveal about the historical political conditions that shape the New Testament? Well, this is something that we talked about. So the Gospel of Philip, right, was part of this collection of texts that were discovered at Nag Hammadi. And basically these texts, right, they weren't included in the canon, but they date back to around the time of the New Testament, so the Gospels. But they weren't included. And we find that in the content of the Gospel of Philip, right, it's basically about we see Mary Magdalene, right? And Mary Magdalene is in an interesting role. She seems to be an important leader. And in fact, right, we looked at how the 12 other apostles kind of have an issue with Mary Magdalene and the fact that Jesus seems to love her more. Jesus kisses her on the lips often. And moreover, it seems that Mary Magdalene from the Gospel of Philip is supposed to kind of inherit the church or take over the central leadership structures. So we talked about that this probably is an example of a text that wasn't included in the canon or the New Testament because of its representation of women. During the Council of Nicaea that Constantine essentially convened to create the canon, Constantine wanted to create a really patriarchal exclusively male-dominant leadership structure for Christianity. So the Gospel of Philip was not included for that reason, right? Because it showed women in leadership positions. Had it been included in the New Testament, right, to conclude this question, what impact would have it had on the canon? Well, we would have likely seen women in leadership positions, right, had the Gospel of Philip been included. Okay, so number 3, how is the prophetic approach to racism in the United States different from the liberal approach? Okay, so this is a key point that we kind of talked about when we were talking about race and Christianity. So the liberal approach to racism is all focused on education. And the liberal approach argues that education is the primary mechanism to redress racism, right? So the point for the liberal approach is that, well, people are just uneducated. The prophetic approach critiques the liberal approach because for the prophetic approach to racism, the argument is that racism is systemically entrenched in America's political, economic, and social structures, including in its education structures. So merely focusing on education is not going to redress how racism is systemically embedded in American institutions. So one of the things that the prophetic tradition, in addition to kind of critiquing liberalism's exclusive focus on education, is that the prophetic approach looks to shame white Americans, right? To use this tradition of shame, which is something that the prophets do in the Bible, right? They shame communities into action. And that's something that Martin Luther King Jr. did a lot, right? He was so effective at using the Bible and Christian traditions to shame white people and motivate them into action, right? Other examples of people who fit within the prophetic tradition are also Harriet Tubman, right? Harriet Tubman saw visions from God. She was very much motivated by the notion of that racism was systemic, and looked to kind of a prophetic, she herself, right, really saw herself as a prophet, and many others saw her as a prophetic figure, who really shamed people into action, to mobilize people into action. Malcolm X could also be an example of someone who fits within this prophetic tradition, and uses the prophetic tradition as a way to mobilize people into action. Okay, number 4. So how is pre-modern Sharia different than modern Sharia? Okay, so pre-modern Sharia was essentially based around the notion of consensus. It was bottom up, right? So in pre-modern Sharia, there wasn't this notion of a universalizing framework, but we talked about how judges would call people together and convene, and they'd basically debate it out, and they'd find a resolution among each other, right? So pre-modern was consensus, bottom up. It was very dynamic and flexible. Modern Sharia, however, is very static. It's unflexible, right? It tends to have this universalizing legalistic framework, right? Guilty or not guilty, right? Modern Sharia is not flexible. It's not bottom up. It's in fact top down. So what shaped this tradition? Well, essentially colonization. So what happens is with modern Sharia, under colonization, specifically British colonization, Sharia blends with Western law to kind of look like Western law, right? So Western law has this universalizing legal framework. There's the notion that justice is supposed to be blind, right? It doesn't matter your individual circumstances, right? The law is not based around consensus. There's a judge, right? The judge decides. So modern Sharia basically is reshaped around colonial systems of law. So Mohammed bin Salman, so he's an interesting character we talked about. Essentially here you can talk about that Mohammed bin Salman really wants to take this static notion of modern Sharia and use digital technologies to further universalize it, to globalize it, right? Mohammed bin Salman wants to use digital technologies so that he can be the sole judge of Sharia, right? So he's kind of takes that modern Sharia framework and uses digital technologies to globalize it, you could say, to overcome political or national divides. Number 5, so how did Orientalist and American scholars approach the study of Islam? So Orientalist here, I'm referring to European scholars. So European scholars, we talked about, focused on texts, right? For them, the notion, they tried to understand what Islam was from the Quran, from Hadith, right? These Islamic texts. Whereas American scholars, right, tried to understand the study of Islam by studying Muslim communities, talking with Muslim communities, right? American scholars wanted to understand Islam from the perspective of Muslims. And what political factors influence their distinctive approaches? Well, for American scholars, right, they saw Muslim communities as allies in the struggle against communism, right? In the 1950s, communism was coming into the Middle East. So essentially, American scholars, right, they wanted to create relationships with Muslim communities to basically be allies together in the fight against communism. Whereas European scholars, that was not the issue during the 19th century. Really, they were impacted by colonization. And they did not see Muslim communities as allies, right? But they saw Muslim communities as beneath them, right? And kind of aberrating or ruining texts, right? They saw Islam as like this perfect thing that you could locate within these texts. And they saw Muslim communities as kind of not doing what they were supposed to be doing as seen in these texts, right? So how did 9/11 generally impact American scholars' approaches? So the key thing here is the notion of, with 9/11, it kind of incited a lot of Islamophobia. So American scholars saw themselves as trying to save Islam from this Islamophobia. So one of the things they wanted to do is kind of construct this notion, this monolithic notion of Islam, right? We talked about this Islam as a religion of peace, right? Or this monolithic idea, and kind of argue that anything that didn't fit this Islam is, moderate, right? Moderate Islam was not in fact Islamic. So groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, right? They wanted to argue, no, they're not Islamic, right? No, despite the fact that they would define themselves as Islamic, right? So the key thing here is just to think about how 9/11 incites Islamophobia. American scholars had this idea of saving Islam, right? But by so doing, end up creating this really monolithic, static notion of Islam that's very inflexible and doesn't take into account Islam's diversity. Okay, so hopefully that helps you with these big essay questions, okay? Good luck to y'all.